パンケーキだ。Delicious.
So I recently watched the 4th season of The Boys, and for the most part, I liked it. I liked the new additions of Sage and Firecracker. I like what they did with A-Train. I like the overarching themes of people having to face their past demons. The episode focusing on Huey's dad really resonated with me, thanks to some recent events. I liked the finale, and of course, I liked Homelander continuing to be the psychotic freak that he is, with him still being the best part of the show. It was the first season of the show I had watched while it was coming out, so the experience was already quite different for me compared to the previous seasons. Before it even aired, some of the early reviews were decidedly more mixed compared to the general positivity that the previous seasons were met with.
It's just hard to be as excited about Season 4 after the back-to-back bangers of Season 3 and Gen V Season 1. I come from a throbbing dinky.
These mixed responses were also not without merit. I also had my fair share of issues with the season, most notably how Frenchie and Kimiko's arcs felt like repetitions of previous seasons, although I do think that they pay off well enough at the end. The frequent use of sexual assault as a punchline, especially with Huey wearing that victim blend for it by Starlight. The Tech Night scenes in episode 6 were also really not that funny outside of a few moments, and often just felt gratuitous and vile, shocking for shocking's sake. None of these factors were enough for me to call the season bad. I still largely enjoyed the show for its characters, its comedy, its violence, and its political satire. The last one being the most controversial part of the show in general, and this season in particular. I personally liked the Disney on Ice parody, the D23 bits, the TruthCon episodes, and the Sesame Street parody.
Antifa.
However, not everyone liked these, and that's perfectly fine. You don't have to agree with the political message of the show, and it's also perfectly fine to express that, as long as you remain respectful, of course. 3 really good seasons and then they destroyed it by adding woke agenda to much LGBT propaganda. I think a movie about superheroes shouldn't show gay kisses and sex in every episode. I will try to watch it till the end, but it's getting really hard. Season 4 introduced degenerate gay content like a porn movie. What a disgrace. Throwing away a build-up from previous seasons to pleasure minorities. Z, classic. The 4th season has turned to the woke EDI trash can. Another series to the dumpster fire. Nope. The Boys descend even further into far-left / neo-Marxist propaganda with season 4. And the writing somehow manages to get even more horrendous. A talentless, dull show that shouldn't even been greenlit after season 2. Frenchie, who was first seen with an attractive female partner and then grew close to a Japanese female whom he freed from imprisonment, suddenly turns gay, which doesn't make any sense for his character. But there's so much more neo-Marxist protocol. It's clear by now that Hollywood hates the Western world. It isn't about money anymore. This is about spending money to destroy the West and everything that made it great. Especially Christianity. These people will never stop. Season 4 is another example, among many, of how mentally ill these people are, and how they want to destroy us. 3 episodes in and nothing happens except for gay dudes making out and dongs swinging around. Homelander stands around doing nothing. Frenchie and Huey scenes can flat be fast forwarded through with no consequence. When does the plot start? When does the Christian bashing by Jewish showrunners stop? Just the in-your-face political messaging every step of the way makes this unwatchable. 1 episode and I'm done. Frenchie's now gay, enough said. It's awful people doing awful things, giving the MAGA crowd a platform to feel good about themselves. Let's also establish that Dennis Quaid's son is not going to be a movement. The French is an asshole. Of course, not everyone expresses themselves like that. It is true that the show has become more overtly political. The show was always political, but those politics were primarily expressed through the lens of corporatism. When The Boys originally came out in 2019, the pop cultural landscape was still dominated by superhero media and cinematic universes, meaning that its satire about superheroes and their place in the larger Hollywood complex, and the role of VOD as a stand-in for a large plutocratic megacorps, both directly and indirectly influenced the political machinations of the United States and by proxy the world, just like actual megacorporations are doing right now. As time has gone by, and the superhero domination of American pop culture has waned due to fatigue, and as American democracy has been primed for an even larger and more direct threat, the show's political satire is pointing increasingly to the direct centers of power. Not to say that this wasn't planned beforehand, some of the general beats of the original comic book have been followed in the show. It just also fell into place with changes in the country that were happening at the same time. In this sense, it actually follows the blueprint of the other big piece of what if superheroes were real media. Alan Moore's Watchmen. Watchmen isn't a satire, but it was the most overtly political work in mainstream superhero comics of its time. Just like how The Boys went from a critique of the cultural phenomenon of the superhero to a broader depiction of the political zeitgeist of its time, Watchmen went from a political, albeit far more serious, depiction of what superheroes would be like in the late Cold War America to a broader exploration of how that same Cold War shaped the culture of that time. Now I'm sure that there's at least a few of you watching right now who physically cringed when I compared The Boys to Watchmen, in large part due to Watchmen's now almost biblical status in the Western graphic novel canon. I do think that Watchmen probably handles its themes with a bit more depth. In fact, that depth of the social commentary of The Boys is often one of the components taken into question by the show's critics. A lot of people have been pointing out that increasingly more of the political satire of The Boys has become referencing instead of heightening and criticizing. The Homelander NFTs as just a reference, the MAGA-esque hats of Homelander supporters are very on the nose. The heightening often only comes in lieu of these events taking place in the Boys universe, rather than it being synthesized into a broader narrative. Another perspective on this situation might be that the world has become so absurd, so heightened in and of itself, that any form of satirization has become virtually impossible. This idea is often referred to as the death of satire. The idea that society has transformed to such a degree that any form of satirization will be indistinguishable from reality. But in order to understand this death, we first need to understand the life of satire. The term satire comes from the French satire, which in turn comes from the Latin satira, which was a poetic medley that listed off different vices. Contempt, anger, and disgust have been associated with satire since its genesis. While there are some earlier works from Egypt and pre-Qin dynasty China that are often classified as satire, it is within the works of Aristophanes that we first see the clear political utility of the form. The target of his satire was often the political establishment, like in the Babylonians, where he criticizes the Athenian polis and its role in the Peloponnesian War, which Athens eventually ended up losing. Aristophanes' work has also been used in favor of the establishment, like when his play Clouds was used in the trial that led to the execution of Socrates. Now it is important to note that it is impossible to say to what extent satire played a role in the final verdict. The figure of Socrates and his relationship with Athens is a somewhat complicated story. Socrates was famously very critical of democracy. That same democracy being taken away by the Spartan puppet regime that was installed after the aforementioned loss of Athens, which was led by one of Socrates' ex-students, Critias. While he wasn't supportive of the regime, he was also not actively against it. Aristophanes even referred to the young pro-Sparta aristocrats that could be found in Athens at the time as Socratified. This wasn't even the first of his students that brought about the end of Athenian democracy, as Alcibiades did the same thing a few years earlier. And another failed uprising of these Socratified youths happened a few years after the regime collapsed, only 2 years before Socrates' execution. So the charges against him corrupting the youth refer to a lot more than just him annoying passersby in the agora. If a guy kept radicalizing young people against democracy, the point that 3 different coups happened as a result of it over the span of a decade, you would probably want to get rid of him as well. On top of this, philosophers of the Greek city-states were often thought of by their contemporaries as secretive and elitist outsiders, which wasn't unprompted since they essentially operated in a way removed from the rest of society, almost cult-like. In fact, if we look at some specific cases, like the case of Pythagoras of Samos and his followers, we can literally speak of some sort of math cult, where it went even so far that either he or his followers killed someone for proving the existence of irrational numbers. Basically, Socrates was perceived by the broader Athenian public as an especially violent and subversive figurehead for a larger group of violent and subversive weirdos. I might also add that in the end, the Athenian government was essentially proven right when it came to the assertion that Socrates thought could threaten to destroy Athenian democracy, when Alexander the Great conquered Athens. Alexander being a student of Aristotle, who in turn was a student of Plato, who in turn was a student of Socrates. While Aristotle's thought is quite a bit more complex and exhaustive compared to what we know of Socrates' philosophy, the fundamental critiques of democracy still remain in his work. Fasting forward a few centuries, late antique and medieval satire often took the form of praise, which was intended as blame. For example, during the medieval period, satire would often take the shape of praise for a lower, undesirable group at the expense of higher groups, which was lessened by being compared unfavorably to them. As is the case with a lot of things in medieval Europe, a lot of this satire came with a healthy dose of anti-Semitism, with Jews often taking the role of the undesirables. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales also used a form of backhanded praise to put a blame on its target. The book is about pilgrims trying to find God and being too obsessed with material possessions to do so. Satire from its inception during antiquity until the early modern period, where it was spearheaded by figures like Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope, was very much its own genre, with its own models and styles. In the late modern era, there is a move away from aesthetic orthodoxy, and satire becomes more of a tone or quality of a particular medium. Satire has become oversaturated as of recently. It has turned into what Robert Fidian, an associate professor of humanities at Flinders University in Australia, refers to as the satirical industrial complex. This complex expresses itself through the centrality of satire within a lot of our stand-up, talk shows, comedic narrative media, and online comedy. Whether through YouTube or through social media posts, this gap between politics and comedy has also been narrowed significantly, with Obama appearing on Between Two Ferns, Trump's tweets, and Biden's dementia, and the comedic sides of presidents have never been more emphasized. The capability of being unserious has become an asset in the political world. Political satire is something that is clearly put on a certain pedestal. Its intrinsic ties to culture and society clearly giving it an air of legitimacy over other forms of comedy, in the eyes of the greater establishment. Some people might take this to an extreme, where they will look at satire as a primarily political utility. It is debatable to what extent satire actually has political utility. The amount of influence and importance that satire has held has been vastly overstated, in my personal opinion. The reason I went on a tangent earlier about some of the details of Socrates' trial is because it's very easy to narrativize the importance of the political utility of satire by emphasizing the importance of Aristophanes' work in the death of what many consider to be the father of Western philosophy. As the details of the trial show, there were many factors that led to the guilty verdict, most of which significantly more important than the writings of a satirist. If the Athenian establishment really put so much stake into the words of Aristophanes, they would have listened to him during the Peloponnesian War and pulled out before their defeat. As a further illustration of the political ineffectivity of even very popular satire, I'd like to talk about the veterans of future wars. After World War I, all American veterans who fought in it were to receive a bonus, but that bonus was not to be paid until 1945. And with the Great Depression hitting after the Wall Street crash in 1929, many veterans wanted their bonuses now. A long and arduous battle followed, which included mass protests at the Capitol with more than 20,000 people, clashes with the authorities, and a fascist conspiracy to take over the United States. Luckily, they never tried this again. Eventually, the government capitulated, and despite an earlier veto from President Roosevelt, it was agreed upon that the veterans would get their bonuses in January of 1936. As we now know, and as a lot of people felt back then, the world was on the brink of another war. Hitler came to power a few years earlier. Japan was rapidly expanding, a civil war was brewing in Spain, and fascist political parties were starting to pop off all around the developed world. It became evident that war was very likely, especially to Louis Jefferson Gorin Jr., a political science student at Princeton University. More young American men would die for their country, and eventually the survivors would get their bonuses as well. But wouldn't the men who would die be more deserving of these bonuses? And since it was a guarantee that young Americans would end up dying on foreign shores, wouldn't it be better if those bonuses were paid right now? This idea formed the beginnings of what would later become the Veterans of Future Wars, or VFW. Gorin's conception of this was outwardly satirical and deliberately extreme, but behind that satire was a directed critique at militarism that resonated with a lot of young men in the United States. For many of them, they still saw the American involvement in World War I as a mistake despite their victory. Isolationism was still the dominant position in the US, to the point that despite the fact that the League of Nations, the predecessor to the UN, was founded on the ideas of then President Woodrow Wilson, America actually voted against joining it themselves. The VFW would prove incredibly popular, with reaching up to 50,000 members at its peak. Newspaper articles were dedicated to it, and contemporary intellectuals contemplated whether this new form of pointed political satire was going to be the movement to kill American interventionary militarism. It was probably the largest actual political movement to come directly out of satire at this point in history. Satire had been used to bolster pre-existing political movements, sure, but this was something completely novel. All of this meant nothing when Pearl Harbor was attacked. In December of 1941, all members of the National Council of the VFW enlisted in the armed forces, with the majority of the organization's membership presumably following in their footsteps. They tried so hard and came so far, but in the end it didn't even matter. After the war, Cohen would praise Roosevelt's efforts to lead the American people away from isolationism, seeing World War II as a necessary war. What this tale illustrates is that even when you have a massive amount of support, even when your position is relatively mainstream, satire is still not enough by itself to bring out political change. On the other side of this coin, we get people that think satire has lost its meaning in our modern culture. The eulogists of satire after its untimely death. Satire is a form of humor that works through impersonation, and usually heightening. Or at least the good satire does this. New Star Wars film to feature female Jedi who turn to the dark side at the same time every month. The modern issue with satire seems to be twofold. The impersonation has become distorted due to a massive rise in misinformation online, and the heightening has become more difficult due to all subtleties and nuance seemingly being stripped away. These subtleties seem to have been stripped away due to a culture that financially motivates outrage and simplicity, and heavily commodifies attention. But you don't need to know any of these more technical aspects in order to feel the world becoming more absurd by the minute. Even if we limit ourselves to the events of this year, we can talk about Trump going on a live stream and saying that electric trucking is terrible before being gifted a Tesla truck minutes later by someone who doesn't understand his policies.
First of all, what happened with abortion is ridiculous. You should not be able to tell a woman what to do with her body. That's first of all. That's a woman's body.
You think
Most critical of being accused of supporting child abuse due to defending puberty blockers in a debate with someone who was literally defending child marriage.
So if you have someone that's your age coming in saying, I want to marry that child, I don't think that can happen under any circumstance.
So,
no.
But it's still a personal decision.
And the world's richest man pretending to be his own infant son on the social media platform that he owns, and making the most embarrassing comments ever imaginable. The world becoming more absurd can also be felt if you compare older satire to the world of today. Many older acclaimed satires don't have the bite that they probably once had. There are even some cases where the satire has become a reality to such an extent that it doesn't even register as heightened anymore. In the 1976 movie Network, for example, they satirized the fetishization of drama and sensationalism due to the commodification of media, with these hard jabs at the American information entertainment complex of the 1970s barely register as our current media landscape has taken this sensationalism and turned it up to 100. Similarly, the satire of music mockumentaries like This Is Spinal Tap often pale in comparison to the bleak absurdity of modern documentaries like Some Kind of Monster. A few years before the GTA 6 trailer dropped, there were rumors that it was going to take place in the past, and I believed them, not because they came from a credible source, but rather because it's so difficult to satirize our current culture, especially since everything changes quite fast and making a game takes years, and in the case of Rockstar up to a decade or longer. A satire of the past also goes down easier. The more recent a joke is, the more likely someone will feel strongly about it and I'll be able to take a joke. But then I saw that they were going in a less satirical direction, and then it started to make sense. Just like when Red Dead Redemption 2, there will probably be some satirical elements, but the actual story will mostly be played straight. In regards to the death of satire, some say that satire died recently. American artists and satirist Tom Lehrer said that satire died when Henry Kissinger got the Nobel Peace Prize. This wasn't the first time that the Peace Prize was given to someone who wasn't exactly a model of peace, and certainly not the last. Some say that satire died when O.J. Simpson published his book, If I Did It, in regards to the murder of his own wife. Or later in 2018, while we're still on the subject of O.J. Simpson, when he got out and he referred to himself on his TikTok as a slayer of women.
I don't like to pat myself on the back. Oh, yes, I do.
German critical theorist Theodor Adorno said that after the Second World War, that satire relied on statements like X claimed to be X, but is actually Y. But due to capitalism simplifying everything into a commodity, this is not possible anymore. Because everything is brought under the same ideological paradigm, everything becomes what its function is in that given paradigm. In the case of capitalism, everything becomes a product. X becomes X, because that's what its function is. The world has become too shallow for satire. Even Alexander Pope said satire was dead in his epilogue to the Satires. He saw the dominant Whig party's politeness as a threat to his biting Tory satire. He was basically complaining about the 18th century equivalent of political correctness. On the opposite end of that spectrum, you have someone like Stuart Lee, who satirizes the whole PC has gone mad type of comedy that became prevalent in the late 2010s. You know the type of comedy, where someone says, "You can't say this anymore," and then says the thing and nothing happens, and complains about people being offended by his shows, which market themselves as being offensive. The commonality with all those who eulogize satire is that they find themselves in opposition to either those in power or the political zeitgeist. Calling upon the death of satire has become a form of satire in and of itself. There are certainly unique aspects to our contemporary society's death of satire: artificial intelligence, social media, fake news. But just like how our society is radically different from satire's previous death, that society was in turn radically different from what came before. Satire died and was born again many times. It's been more of a perpetual metamorphosis for satire in order to accommodate different conditions. In the postmodern age, it's fittingly being accommodating to micro-narratives through the internet. Instead of satirizing the grand political regimes and larger trends, although we still do that, we are today more likely to see satires based on online trends, categorization, mimetic typologies, etc. It's generally more niche, but those niches are easier to satirize due to their novelty and by proxy, relative purity of self-awareness. The greater political establishment has been regurgitated by satire over and over again. This, mixed with political stagnation that can be felt in many developed nations, especially those that have been subject to neoliberal regimes for the last few decades, like the United States, contributes to the lack of appeal of a greater satire of the political establishment. The Boys' satire shines through in the smaller unique moments, like the right-wing Disney on Ice parody or the Puppet song, but a lot of parallels to real life utilized in the grander narrative are often lifted as is. Much of the absurdity that can be found in what we've seen of GTA 6 so far is strange enough, but none of it matches the strangest things you can find on YouTube or TikTok right now. It's not heightened, it's just depiction. A lot of modern satire also just exists purely as a statement, resulting in what is sometimes referred to as clapter, rather than laughter. This might also contribute to the counterintuitive results that satire can sometimes bring. The very strong sense of moralism mixed with arrogance that can often be found with a lot of satirists could possibly come off as sanctimonious and off-putting. A culture of anti-intellectualism could possibly also make the medium of satire seem like a tool for the elite to criticize non-establishment politics or behavior that could be appealing to an audience that in turn feels attacked by the criticism. Satire still exists in many of the same forms, but the nature of it has changed due to the world changing around it. In the media, it has either become a recontextualization of real phenomena, or it has heightened so much to the point of becoming absurdist. Its utility has also changed. It has become part of a modern wave of misinformation, whether intentionally or not. You've probably noticed this when you saw a comment that was insane and you had no way of knowing whether it was serious or not. Yeah, that used to be a lot less common. Most modern online satire is not labeled as such. Due to this, satire can be utilized as propaganda in the modern context. This blurring line between satire and misinformation has been exacerbated by artificial intelligence, where even the absurd is threatening to become indistinguishable from reality. Satire has had to accommodate our modern culture and has become less subtle and nuanced, but any sort of distortion that existed previously has been smoothed out, because no distortion is able to match the absurdity of our current reality. I do not believe satire to be dead yet, but I do believe we are seeing, right now, is a transition of satire to constantly follow and keep up with our culture, which is transforming more rapidly than ever. I do think that it's possible that satire might die in the near future, due to the rapidly decreasing importance of reality and truth in our media and culture. But we do need to keep in mind that satire has died over and over and over again. I don't think those earlier eulogies for satire were necessarily premature or incorrect. Satire does die. It dies constantly and keeps being reborn. We're currently in the dying breaths of satire, awaiting for it to rise back from the ashes. Satire is dead. Long live satire.